Yes.
Thank you. Before we look at financial recompense, Lynne, I've been asked to invite you to explore one issue we talked about this morning a little bit more. Your experience of seeking a public inquiry. Can you tell us whether there were any particular obstacles you faced when you were campaigning for a public inquiry?
From the very beginning, well, I think it was the fact that the government kept saying that there was no fault, and then when we had the Lindsay tribunal, obviously in Ireland they compensated on moral grounds, and they took responsibility. But the government changed that line, and the government kept saying that the situation in Ireland was different. Therefore, that was repeated and repeated and repeated. So obviously all the civil servants over the years were briefed, and everybody kept saying the same thing. And that then, the same was said in Welsh Government. They just repeated the mantra, really, that it was different and there was no fault, the circumstances were different. Therefore, they'd come back and they'd say, well, there will be no public inquiry, but we'll offer a bit more assistance, really. So it was only really when it was 2015, 2016, when the Department of Health issued the proposals for financial support, and they were only including widows at £10,000 each. We then thought as a charity that we had to seek legal advice on it. We tried some solicitors and we didn't find anybody. And then I wrote to barristers in Cardiff asking, did they know of a barrister who could advise us legally? Because we knew it was the only answer, it was the only way of getting to the truth. Obviously, as a group of trustees, we're all affected or infected volunteers, and there were people there that just didn't have time to wait. So we thought, well, we'd try and get some legal advice. And the lawyers in the barristers in Cardiff, they said, well, it was going to be expensive, obviously, to get legal advice in the first instance. And I said, well, I didn't know any barristers at the time. I just sent a general inquiry in with like a paragraph about what we were looking for. And I said, well, could they recommend any kind solicitors who would see us free of charge? And that's when we came into contact with Watkins and Gunn, I can say, so Michael Imperato at Watkins and Gunn. And as a group of trustees, we went in to see him. We all went, and we just explained what had happened to each one in our group. And it was the first time, really, that we'd had any interest from anyone to take on the cause, because I think it was seen as such a massive problem. And when people actually in a group, I'm sure other people will have felt this, once you start telling your story to members of the public who don't know anything about it, they actually think you're a bit crazy, because they would think, well, why, government wouldn't do this wouldn't happen, and it has happened. So it was only by meeting Michael. Michael said, well, they can't have a consultation in England and expect Wales to contribute, because Wales is a country in its own right.
And that consultation was about financial assistance, just so that everyone is
to start with, yes,
yep.
Yeah, and we raised funds through crowd justice then. We put out an appeal, but the ultimate goal was to get the public inquiry. And from that time onwards, that's how we started getting progress, because we didn't know how to go about doing that, really, and we needed legal advice to do that, and it was just a stroke of luck, really, that that we started speaking to Michael about it.
I'm sure if there are further questions arising from that.
Sorry, I do have something else to say, if that's okay. So the other thing that was fortuitous as well is I met my friend at the Haemophilia Alliance meetings. And through her, I met her sister, who was an MP at the time, and she's now... Because of her position, she was able to open doors at the Department of Health. We'd have never been able to get a meeting with, Lord Pryor or... at the Department of Health. We wouldn't have got to see Sir Chris Wormwald, and that was just through, because obviously we would have just been ignored, so she opened the door, and that was through my friend.
I want to move on now to issues of financial recompense, and I'm conscious that some of what we've talked about is woven into that, so we'll pick different things up. In terms of Scotland, Bill, we spoke about the announcement by Shona Robertson the day after the Penrose report. The first step that was then taken was the financial review chaired by Ian Walsh.
Yes.
And you were a part of that group.
Yes.
You've described several principles being established that you regard as being central to the schemes. Can you tell us what those principles are?
Well, as Bruce said yesterday, nobody gets any less as a result of that exercise. And I'm referring to, sorry, my memory, I sometimes need to refer to documentation. I'm referring to Witness 051. The reason I refer to this is because it sets the context for what happened during the financial review. Because the context was set the day after the Penrose report came out. And there's reference in there. It seems that the particular official has put words in the mouth of the First Minister. But basically they put, he's advised ministers that we agree with Mr. Wright's observation, and that's why we'll carry out an immediate commitment to review and improve the financial support schemes on offer to the people affected and their families, and this is the important bit, to be concluded before World Haemophilia Day in April 2016. Now, we were very conscious of avoiding drift, so we'd put that idea into government's mind about time. And I remember having this debate with Dan about, you know, let's set them a target date. Let's not have the sort of ongoing yearly, oh, well, we need to review this, we need to review that. And in a sense, we were setting ourselves a very tight deadline. So we wanted people to be involved in this exercise. That was the second principle, that it wasn't just going to be, you know, a bunch of the great and the good, maybe with us tagged onto it. I mean, there was a strong representation. Bruce was there, Alice was there, the SIBF, our partner organisation in Scotland, were there. And it was actually a good exercise, if I can say that.
Just in terms of the core principles
Yeah.
that you felt was central, nobody was worse off,
Yeah.
and that people were
Involved.
central and involved.
Yes.
And part of the involvement of people was a consultation exercise that Haemophilia Scotland were commissioned to undertake.
The Dan Roadshow, our chief executive, he went out and he listened to what people had to say. He went to Aberdeen, Dundee, Inverness, Glasgow, Edinburgh. But the other thing that Dan did that was really important was, you know, there were some people who don't actually like talking in a forum like this. So he did one-to-one stuff, sometimes face-to-face and sometimes on the telephone. And he brought all that stuff back. And that was really constructive. And there were some messages came out of that particular exercise, one of which reinforced the point about points about time and points about not being any worse off. There was a third thing that came through loud and clear from that exercise. And this relates to what then was subsequently the view during the clinical review, that the clinical review came up with. And that was, people did not want assessment. They didn't want to have to go through the big rigmarole. If you go through assessment, and I have personal experience of this, it takes a very, very long time.
I want to pick up assessment with the clinical review in a moment, but can I just finish off the financial review? in addition to those principles, can I ask, were there any financial limits or parameters placed on the group in relation to what they could recommend?
No. One of the reasons we wanted to do this was we wanted to do exactly the opposite to what David Cameron had done to us the day before. We wanted to build this from the ground up. Now, you know, government has to look at property and so on and so forth. But at the end of the day, we wanted to say to government, look, let's look at a scheme. And we arrived at, because we got completely fed up, we invited Jan Barlow during the financial review to come and present to us. And I'm afraid after we received her presentation, we decided we definitely didn't want to go down the road of staying with the Alliance House organisations. So we were really keen that this was a bottom-up exercise, and the Minister went for that. And that was so important, to give people the voice. And obviously there were conflicting messages came across as, to a certain extent, is represented in the Minority Report. We've moved on from that since in our thinking. But there was this, you know, there were these very clear messages coming through. On reflection, one of the things that I think we maybe, because of the time imperative that in effect we'd set, that we maybe didn't quite get right was we were still very stuck to the stage 1, stage 2 hepatitis thing. Hands up, you know, and the signals we were getting from government was that they didn't really want to break that because of what was at that time, prior to the clinical review, seen as a clinical element in all of this. You can prove somebody's got cirrhosis, they've got, you know, cancer, so on and so forth. So that was a bit of a shibboleth that we couldn't really knock down.
And I think you've said there's a second element that you feel the group got wrong in some ways, and that was the position of widows.
Well, no. Actually, we fought very hard for widows, but it was stage 1 widows that we let down at that particular point. There was a misunderstanding about stage 1 widows. I'll come on to the percentage business because, no, I remember there was a point at which, when we were starting to talk figures, that the whole thing was based on a principle of the median wage. We talked around average wages. And we arrived, government agreed that £27,000 at that point was the median wage. So the whole scheme was constructed around that. 10,000 added on for those co-infected. And there was a figure of a one-off figure for stage 1s. So the widows, I remember the moment, I can't remember if it was Bruce or I, when we were saying, well, you know, what's going to happen here? This is something I feel so passionately about because I've sat in widows' houses. And they pour out their stories. It's a very intimate experience. And they'll be in tears. And so I remember Bruce and I, between us somehow, the original proposal that I think came from government was about 50%. And it was either Bruce or I said, what about 75? And we didn't have to push too hard. They went for it. So the scheme was built around that, but the point that I regret was we didn't also make clear that the payments to stage 1s at that point. I think we probably should have nailed it. Let's call it a misunderstanding.
You then appeared before the Scottish Parliament's Health Committee on the 9th of February 2016, and that issue was addressed at that point. Is that right?
Yeah, I was pushing the committee pretty hard not to delay anything. Let's not get into party politics here. Let's get this money. Money in the pocket is the thing that matters. We can wait another 2, 3, 4 years after this inquiry, And, you know, how many people are going to be left? So I wanted to get money into people's bank accounts. If I can illustrate this. Time was moving on. We'd presented the financial report. There's a bit in between here. We presented the report to government. Government indicated they would accept it in full. But there was a bit in between. We were getting a bit close to World Haemophilia Day. In the meantime, there was a man dying. And my God, that was hard, because he was one of... I need to be very careful here, because I'm conscious of protecting the family. But he was one of, let's just say, a family of brothers. And he'd been through hell, and we thought he'd made it. Transplants, Hodgkin's, come out the other side, got treatment. And we knew his daughter had 2 severe haemophilia sons. So we were in contact, you know, with that family. And the daughter texted me. I actually remember about 4 months earlier, I was in Isle of Skye, and she phoned me and said, Dad's had a really bad diagnosis. He'd developed, because of the treatment he'd had during Hodgkin's, he'd developed leukemia. And I remember she phoned me. I couldn't actually believe it at the moment, because he'd been so lively. And so she texted me to say, where are we up to with the financial review? Because he would want to ensure that that his widow was looked after. So I got back to her and I said, would you allow me to take the wording of that text to the minister? She agreed, and I did, and the minister agreed. And that's the sort of personal impact that's important in all of these personal stories, in that they weren't just seen as cases or figures or statistics. And so I think it's important to bear that in mind in relation to what then happened, because I think the minister appeared before us that day at the Health Committee.
And then I want to move you forwards to the clinical review group in mid-2017.
Yes.
Chaired by David Goldberg. You were
Yes.
one of the patient representatives on it.
Yes, there was myself, the Chief Executive of Haemophilia Scotland, and Tommy Leggett, who's the manager of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum. I'd like to place on record, please, that our partner organisation, the Scottish Infected Blood Forum, Tommy, I can't remember at that time if he was paid, but he still continues to be the manager, but he does it on a pro bono basis without pay.
I'm going to pick up issues of funding towards the end of today. Can we just have a focus on one particular matter in relation to the clinical review? And that is, you've said in your statement that one of the most difficult issues you had to address during the clinical review group was the issue of assessment.
Correct.
What were the difficulties and the issues that were being discussed in the group about assessment?
Well, we were asked, because we were still in this stage 1, stage 2 situation, we were asked to examine the whole situation in relation to those who who from a clinical perspective in terms of the liver and hepatitis had not gone on to transplant, carcinoma, cirrhosis. And there's a big issue there because, as I think Bruce indicated yesterday, it's not a simple matter. It infects other parts of the body. However, we were there really to look at the stage 1 situation. And the Minister, in the terms of reference for the clinical review, had specifically asked us to look at this question. So we started kicking this around, and what was really interesting, during the financial review, patients, I'd already said, don't want assessment. When it came to the clinical review, the clinicians were saying, we don't want to do assessment because it affects the relationship between the patient and the their consultants. Now, there were psychologists, hepatologists, haematologists on that clinical review, along with the 3 of us, and a specialist nurse, and David as chair as epidemiologist. So it was actually one of the consultants came up with the idea. One of the big problems we've had in all of this was that patients, I hate the word victims, but victims have never been trusted. So why not let's give this back? Why not let them assess themselves? We thought, government's never going to swallow that. And it was unanimous. Let's go for it. I've still got an outstanding bet with the manager of the Scottish Infected Blood Forum about how the proportions were going to break down. I think I owe him lunch. But what then happened was we put it back. People were able, are you severely affected? Are you moderately affected? Or on a sort of day-to-day type basis, it's not really affecting you? And government accepted the report.
As you say, those recommendations were accepted by the Scottish government, and so the position, as the inquiries heard from previous evidence, is of self-declaration. Lynne, thinking about the position in Wales, can we go all the way back to 2013, 2014 in relation to the Macfarlane Trust? Your statement talks about the fact that you gathered information about the difficulties people were having with the trust. Can you tell us a little bit about what those difficulties were?
Well, they basically couldn't get any money out of the trust. People would ring and the calls wouldn't be returned. They were asking for support, but there would always be a really lengthy grant process. People weren't given guidelines of what they could and could apply for. And basically there was just no money coming forward. And that was a major issue. Those experiences had been combined with, we'd had a review of care, and obviously grouped in with care is obviously financial support. And we just had lots and lots of patients' experiences about the whole issue. So obviously, the people that came to the meetings, at the cross-party group meetings, they talk about their personal experiences. There was then the debate in Parliament, where the experiences were the same wherever you lived. And we just felt, well, it was difficult because we didn't really want to engage with the schemes because we didn't believe in the schemes. We knew they'd been set up to give as little as possible to people. And we knew a large part of our group weren't included. So it was a difficult situation. Obviously, it was set up in that way to divide the community, because if you're in a meeting with a lot of people, and there would be maybe 30 or 40 people in a meeting at the Welsh Assembly, and you've got parents of children, and children, adult children who lost their parents, once you start getting into detail about schemes and stage 1s and stage 2s, and it becomes an impossible meeting. So we had to think of a way forward where we would stay as a group, and we wouldn't really get into all the details of the schemes. We obviously knew what was going on in Scotland, and we knew that, you know, the widows were included, but that wasn't the whole answer. You know, we looked to a wider settlement, which was the Irish settlement, and we just felt that that would address all the issues that people in a room were having. We felt, well, that scheme, it was the best we knew of. We didn't know of anything that was better than that. And you could sort of pinpoint the issues people were having, and you think, oh, well, if they were under the Irish scheme, that would work, that could work. So we were really reticent to get into the detail, but we were sort of forced into that position then, and it's as if that's why when you come to meetings in Parliament, then you'll get maybe a minister or a politician thinking, oh, you just want a better deal than, you know, the next scheme, but the schemes were all wrong anyway. So we sort of avoided that, and we just thought, well, as a group, people told us they weren't interested in tweaks to the schemes. They wanted the truth. They wanted the truth. They wanted to know what happened, what had happened to their loved one. You know, they wanted justice, and they wanted compensation because, you know, they were entitled to compensation, and everybody knew it. Everybody in our group knew that, and they knew how wrong they'd been. So there was a reticence to try and push for an increase on a stage 1 or a stage 2, because it was very divisive by nature, and we had to, like, we're small, but we had to keep our group together. You know, we represent, like, there's 300 people, and we thought, well, we're not funded by government. We can do what we want as a charity. We're representing the interests of our people, and they're telling us what they want. You know, and people, if it was a meeting like that, they could put their hand up and they can say whatever they want, and we're not beholden to government because we're relying on them for funding. So it was just a last desperate attempt to try and get the right thing for the community.
In terms of the McFarlane Trust, when the monies were being transferred to the Terence Higgins Trust,
yes,
you lobbied against that.
I did, yes.
What was your concern?
Well, I attended all of the all-party group meetings in Westminster, and the concern was, particularly by our Welsh group, that we already had a different scheme by that time. We already had the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme. So sort of going back a stage, we were heavily involved in the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme, and we fed our concerns into Welsh Government, and they tried to set up a more holistic approach. So we felt they'd sort of listened in that regard, but there wasn't enough money in the scheme, so, you know, it could never work properly. But as regards the McFarlane Trust, we just thought, well, we wanted it to do all the things that the other trusts weren't doing, McFarlane, Skipton and what have you. But there was a particular issue with the Welsh people, you know, the HIV-infected community, because they weren't consulted about it. We had no input into it. I would go to the all-party groups and I'd make it clear that we didn't want the money to go into the Terence Higgins Trust. People, they were just really deeply offended by that, and we asked that the money be divided. We understand they didn't have psychological support in England, which we had in Wales, but we just said, well, why can't the Welsh beneficiaries just have their share of the reserves that are left? And that I voiced that, you know, at lots of APPG meetings. Jackie Doyle-Price attended one of the meetings as well. But it just was ignored. And then the next thing, we weren't told, but the money had gone to the Terence Higgins Trust. I then started to engage with the Terence Higgins Trust, and I think I've spoken to 3 separate administrators who were administering the fund. And basically they're assessing need is what they told me. And I said, well, are you providing grants? Because in Wales, people would prefer to have grants. Oh no, we're just providing services. And counselling services, great. You know, if you don't have counselling, that's good. But in Wales, we already had psychological support. We had welfare and benefits advice. We'd already got that under the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme. So we thought it was really unfair that you know, the HIV infected, why they didn't get their proportion of that. So again, it was one of those issues where we felt in Wales that, as involved as I was, my voice wasn't being heard. And I felt that we had the support of our group. We'd asked our group what they wanted, what did they want to do. All the replies came back. They didn't want it going to the Terence Higgins Trust. And our worry was that the money would be used on various administrators and there wouldn't be any money left anyway. So it was just one of those examples again where, you know, as a small charity, like with all volunteers, I run the charity from my home. But we have a really good understanding of our members in our group. And we knew, like at a meeting, I can say this is what our group want. And we don't have other groups in Wales. We don't have any other campaigning groups. You know, we represent everybody who's had infected blood or blood products, families, bereaved families. And we pretty much we can say what we like, we can say what we want to say, and that's the voice of all the people in Wales that can't come up to these meetings. You know, I'm trying to speak for them, but I just felt that I was ignored.
You had a particular query about something called the Honeycomb Fund and the Wilson Fund,
yes,
and where they'd gone. What were your concerns about those?
Well, they were legacies that had been set up, and they were specifically for HIV widows, so that they could retrain to well, I wouldn't like to use the phrase, I think it was used during the evidence, to move on then, but to train, you know, to have courses or training to get back to work. And when I asked questions about that at the all-party group meeting, you know, other people say, oh yeah, I might have heard of it, but it wasn't really very well known. This came from some of the older widows who remembered the very early days of the Macfarlane Trust. So we asked, well, when the Macfarlane Trust was wound up, where did that money go? Where was the Wilson Fund and the Honeycomb legacy? And basically, I don't think anybody knew where it had gone. So I contacted Welsh Government, Department of Health official there, and asked her to if she could find out what had happened. But the reply came back from the department that the Macfarlane Trust was a charity and they had no influence over where that money went. So we're still trying to find out about that. The other issue we had with the Macfarlane Trust was the fact that they transferred all the data to Russell Cook solicitors, but we didn't know about that. That came, you know, and there were people then coming forward. They'd heard about the inquiry, but they couldn't access their data. And we were just told, well, you know, that's what's happened to them. I did speak to them, and, you know, the solicitor there was very helpful. But again, it's one of these officials who doesn't know anything about the background, about what's happened. They've just put it in. It's like another new system of, you know, just making it more and more difficult, really, for people to get any information from.
In terms of financial support for hepatitis C,
yes.
In your statement, you've said that Haemophilia Wales has been instrumental in maintaining pressure for adequate financial support. Starting in 2016,
right.
There was a consultation running about infected blood support. Who did you understand that consultation applied to?
Well, we didn't know, basically. We assumed when the Department of Health, you know, started the consultation, it was for the whole of the UK. And then you're sort of in this dilemma. Well, if you advise people not to engage with it, they're not going to have their views known. And again, that's how we went, you know, we sought legal advice on that because we really didn't know what was happening. Once the apology had been made by David Cameron, and then there was the other announcement where they said, well, you know, the schemes were going to be the responsibility of the devolved powers. We didn't really know. So it was, our lawyers then said, well, we need to have a Wales-specific consultation.
Just before we get to the Wales-specific consultation, can we look at the response that Haemophilia Wales did to the English consultation?
Right.
WITN 3988008. And can I page 2, please, Shumik? Thank you. We can see at the top of the page, it says, response to Department of Health proposals and consultation infected blood, 21st of January 2016, England only. The proposed scheme is for England only. Welsh affected people have been asked to complete the consultation questionnaire by Carwyn Jones and Mark Drakeford, but the proposals do not apply to Wales. The proposals for England do not provide either the infected or the affected with a basic level of financial security. No one will be better off, and many claimants will be worse off. And then if we carry on to page 4, please. And the second paragraph, very, very pithily in your response, you've said, as these proposals are totally inadequate, we believe the Welsh Government should commit to doing something better in Wales. That was your position in relation to the, if I call it the English consultation. How would you reach the understanding that it was England only?
It was from the advice from our lawyers, because obviously we were a devolved power. We had our own government, and that we needed to challenge Welsh Government to do more.
You then had a meeting with Vaughan Gethin on the 6th of July 2016, and we've got a letter following up from that meeting that's dated August. Before we get to the letter, can you tell us what that meeting was about? What happened at that meeting?
Can you remind me?
Of course, no, we can go to it, that's fine. That wasn't meant to be a memory exercise. WITN 3988
so many meetings.
009. And if we could have page 2, please, Shumik. Two particular paragraphs. The second paragraph from Vaughan Gethin. I appreciated you conveying the community's views about the consultations and surveys that have taken place over a number of years, recent announcements about reform in Scotland and likely implications for those in Wales if the England reform proposals were adopted. And then, skipping a paragraph, I appreciate you were concerned about the mixed messages you were receiving about responsibilities for the HIV hepatitis C schemes. I'm pleased to advise that the Department of Health has now confirmed it will continue to fund payments for the current spending review period. That I don't think can be right, the date that's given there, and that future arrangements will be determined as part of the subsequent spending review. It references a meeting on the 6th of July. Do you recall what was discussed then?
Yeah, so I think we were just saying that people in Wales would be worse off under the new proposals, and if Wales were going to implement that, they were doing the wrong thing. That I think they basically in England they'd said the widows could have a £10,000 one-off payment, which we thought was disgusting. And we just asked, could something more be done? So I think that's when they decided that they would have these the workshops and consultations in Wales.
And what can you tell us about those?
Yeah, so what happened, I think we had a few meetings in between this, but basically Welsh Government said that they would want to hear the views, of everybody across Wales. Of course, as a group, we already knew we knew all the views anyway, but they had to have their consultation process. But again, it was a bit like the Alistair Burt survey they did it for the in England or for the UK. When Alistair Burt did his survey, they asked people what they wanted, and one of three was that everybody wanted a statutory inquiry. But the Department of Health, then, they issued their next bit of the consultation, and they took that first answer out of it, so that wasn't even asked. And the survey we had for Welsh Government was basically just focused on the scheme, the financial support. What can we do better to support you, this sort of thing. But it was good because people had an opportunity then to engage directly with the Welsh Government officials, and they were done across Wales, so that was good. But there was a feeling within our group that it didn't get to the nitty-gritty of it, but what came out of it was that people, they needed more support. They needed welfare and benefits advice. There was obviously the problem with the widows who weren't getting any money, but it didn't look at the wider picture because none of the rest of the affected community, the children and the parents, they wouldn't have been invited to those consultation meetings, and that caused a problem for us because they weren't labelled as beneficiaries, and those people were leading people in our campaign, which made our group very strong. They weren't beneficiaries, so they couldn't engage. So again, it was that issue where, as the chair of the charity, you've got to explain to people that we're having these meetings, you can't come. That had never happened before. We'd never done it that way in Wales. We just invited anybody who wanted to come could come. So that was a particular problem. And then out of the back of that consultation, did come some improvement. They did offer the 3-year equivalent payment for widows. But again, after the 3 years, there was nothing. So the Welsh widows, they had a little bit more money, but when you think that they're paying off debts, and a lot of them have lived in real poverty for years and years and brought their children up, that money didn't last at all because they were paying off debts that they'd incurred or money they'd borrowed from family. So we felt Welsh Government, they did listen, but again, the consultation was so narrow. It didn't even touch the surface, really, of what was needed. But out of the back of that, then, the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme was set up. And as per, issues that were raised during the consultation, psychological support was provided, and also welfare and benefits advice. So they did try and make it a more holistic scheme, and all the issues people had with the previous Alliance House Trust, like, they couldn't get through, they couldn't talk to people. They had a single point of contact, and, the scheme was set up. There's a hospital, the Balindra Cancer Hospital in Cardiff, and the welfare and benefits advisors, they're specialists they worked there previously, but they are part of the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme, so they're really good at getting, where you have appeals for, PIP appeals and things like that. We were really struggling. Well, as a child, we're really struggling to advise people on that because we're not experts. But they've got really good support there, and that bit of it works well, and it is much needed. The psychological support, we did already have psychological support in Wales. Am I okay to go?
Of course.
Yeah, we did already have psychological support in Wales, and that was as a result of the 2011 Task and Finish Group review. And that review was, we took part in that, but basically it was a multidisciplinary input then to the review. And even though the number one concern for the patients was the hepatology, what came out of the back of it was that psychological support was provided. So we already had 4 psychologists who'd been appointed in 2011, and they were in the haemophilia centres, but that was of no consequence to the people who had transfusion, so they hadn't had any psychological support. So that was included in the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme. And that works well because if they're haemophiliacs, they can go to the centre if they're affected or infected by contaminated blood. And we did make sure of that in 2011, that the haemophilia psychological support wasn't just for the infected person, it was for the affected family as well, and anybody can access that, bereaved families as well. And we wanted to make sure that that happened with the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme. And there are some families who would just find it too upsetting to go back to the haemophilia centre. So that works well, that it's in another hospital. And, the feedback I get is the advisors, they're very good and they offer the right approach. And people feel that they can speak to them openly, and they do help, with regards to benefits and the things that we were really struggling to do as a charity.
So that holistic approach, that side of it, from what you say, seems to be working well.
Yes.
In terms of the financial side, some campaigners in Wales were seeking the introduction of a special category mechanism in Wales. Haemophilia Wales wasn't in support of that. Can you tell us why that was? What were your concerns about a special category mechanism?
So, one of our trustees is under the English scheme because of this silly... what would you, I don't know why it happens like that, but when they made the schemes devolved, obviously it was the country of infection. So he lives in Wales now, and he's a trustee of Haemophilia Wales, but he was infected in England, so he comes under the English scheme. So we knew he'd had terrible difficulty proving that he was proving the SCM in England, but to us, he is badly impacted, and we just thought that was wrong. Because we have, as part of the haemophilia review in 2011, the Minister, Edwina Hart, she announced that we would have a group in Wales, which was called the All Wales Advisory Group on Inherited Bleeding Disorders, which we sit on as Haemophilia Wales, and patients can come and they can relay any issues they have to them. But basically, I've forgotten the question. Sorry.
Why you weren't in favour of a special category?
Right. Yeah. So basically, we obviously we're in close contact with the haemophilia doctors, and they're always very helpful, and we work collaboratively with them to make sure that any issues we have, we try and bring everybody together so everybody's on the same page. And the consultant that was a member of our group, he said that he knew there were difficulties in England with the UKHCDO in England, because they were having to basically jump through hoops to prove this special category mechanism. So we decided as a group that it wouldn't be the right thing just because England had it. Why do we want to copy something that isn't working in England? So we put up a proposal, and we thought, well, if we had a panel, and under the Wales Infected Blood Support Scheme and the work I've done at the Welsh Assembly with hepatitis C elimination, there are really good hepatologists on that group, and they're very nice, and they're very approachable. And we had this idea that maybe they could be sort of a panel, and if somebody felt they were more impacted than stage one, they could go and they could relay their concerns, and it would be done in a very nice way. It wouldn't be bureaucratic. So that was one proposal. And then obviously there was the self-assessment, where people would, if they felt they were more impacted psychologically, they could relay that as well. And then out of the back of that, Welsh Government came up with a better proposal, which was that people could self-assess to get an enhanced payment. And we looked at the form, and we tried to, we obviously fed into it just to make it really simple. And it's just 3 questions, and you don't need medical support in evidence. And anybody who's been infected, they can fill that in themselves. They don't have to tell anybody. And then obviously they can apply for the higher payment.
And that's the scheme that's been in place for those needing additional support.
Yes, yeah. So, but as I say again, it was about speaking to the doctors who would have that additional workload then to go through all the the applicants, and obviously the haemophilia centres. they could do it. But then when you've got a transfusion person, they don't have any direct contact with a multidisciplinary team, because often they're not even being monitored if they're stage 1, which is a real problem, and that does need to be addressed, that these people are stage 1, they've had the new treatments after a huge battle, but they need ongoing monitoring and support, but they don't have access back in. They have to start with their GP again. And the GP will say, oh, you don't need it because you've had the treatment.
And so there's nobody who could write that clinical letter, is that?
Yeah, there isn't anybody. So that it's harder for transfusion people because they are completely, they're not even part of a haemophilia cohort then.
Simon, if I can pick up with you. You started lobbying and campaigning in relation to financial recompense, I think in about 2015. And after the English consultation was announced, you wrote to the leader of the DUP in Westminster, Nigel Dodds. Go ahead.
Sorry, yes, I did. There was a large block of DUP MPs, and as a consequence, my original idea was to try and communicate with as many constituency MPs as possible, and I did, and there were a number of those from other parties as well who were on the APPG, and they were very helpful in raising issues and generally discussing issues within that Westminster community, not only of the Northern Ireland Westminster MPs, but of sharing discussion with others, and anything which raised the issue in relation to Northern Ireland was important. Remember, the situation for us was up until 1998, we had direct rule, and then we had a very sporadic and broken system until we got to 2017 when it fully collapsed under RHI, and then we were back in full, effectively direct rule, but it was direct rule from a distance, if you like, almost by proxy, and that has only changed again. And during that period, during a couple of sittings of government, the majority bloc of the DUP MPs had a greater significance of influence. And therefore, we felt it would be useful to communicate with them and try and get them to highlight the issues that we had as a community of sufferers in Northern Ireland in relation to payment schemes, because we were watching schemes changing and we were watching schemes varying. And there was an anxiety that we would be left behind once more in that situation. So that was the main purpose, to try and keep us at the forefront.
And you received a reply, we have that, WITN 2339018, please, Shumik. If we could have page 2, please. And in the first 2 paragraphs, we can see that he thanks you for your recent letter about the English consultation and says, I've noted your concerns and will bear them in mind if and when the matter is raised in Parliament. However, health in Northern Ireland is a devolved matter and comes under the, it says remind, I think it probably means remit, of the Department of Health here. Any changes to health schemes in England does not mean there will be automatic changes to any such schemes in Northern Ireland, as that would be a matter for our Minister for Health to decide on.
Yes, well, we can untangle the semantics of that in reality, because effectively I have submitted other letters for evidence where it indicates also that there was a reference back to the Minister of Health in Northern Ireland.
We're absolutely going to come back to that in a moment, Simon. If we can just take it in stages. Yeah. In terms of this letter, what was your feeling when you received it?
Well, I was less than enamoured. Effectively, I knew that in reality, the Department of Health in Northern Ireland looked over its shoulder at England in order to get its guidance, and that had been a traditional system within the civil service because we had so many years of direct rule. So I was rather sceptical at that and saw it as the beginning of a process of delay. Now, I'm sure Mr. Dodds meant very well and was trying to be helpful, but the reality was something else.
And so you wrote to Margaret Ritchie raising concerns, and she made representations to the Department of Health.
She did, yes, she did indeed. And of course, there was reference back to members of the constituency parties who were in the Assembly. But the reality of all of that was that it was actually central government that made decisions and was the guiding instrument for even our own department in terms of the treatment and payment schemes and support for haemophiliacs and infected and affected.
And we've got the reply from the Department of Health. If we could put that up, please, Shumik. WITN 2339020. And if we can pick up the second and third paragraphs, please. We've acknowledged that while the existing ex gratia schemes of support have made a significant difference to the lives of many beneficiaries, many people remain unhappy with the current system of financial and other support. Reforming the current payment schemes remains a priority, and we're keen to get this right for those affected. The consultation seeks views on providing discretionary payments for travel and accommodation costs relating to ill health. However, the scheme bodies have always been clear that any discretionary payments they've made to registrants of the schemes will not necessarily continue to be made in the future. And then at the end of the document, you're referred to the consultation document and encouraged to provide responses. What was your view of this response?
Unsurprising and representative of the general approach that we were being kept at arm's length, and effectively we were being kept under control. I find it insulting, and so does a lot of my fellow sufferers, when we were told that this was something which may not necessarily continue in the future, considering the fact that the needs and also the health needs and the welfare needs of a number of sufferers would continue regardless of that. And therefore, that in itself was an unsatisfactory answer with an unsatisfactory conclusion. And
in terms of how valuable your response to any consultation would be, you also received a response from Sylvia Herman MP. If we could have that, WITN 2339021.
Yes, Lady Sylvia was on the APPG for a period of time, and therefore she was well informed.
She refers to a letter from Simon Hamilton MLA, which you've not been able to trace at this stage, but which we will hopefully track down. We can see that she's providing you with a copy of his letter, but she also quotes part of his reply in the third paragraph. You'll note, however, that he stated in his reply that the consultation is an opportunity for all those who've been affected to express their views. And although the proposals in the consultation paper are for England only, all UK patients have been invited to respond.
Yes. Well, as I said earlier, that is indicative of, if it's read carefully by people like myself, that's indicative of a message which says that that what happens in England will ultimately happen in Northern Ireland, and therefore it was essential that we should respond to that under the circumstances.
And if we go to the bottom, we can see that, in fact, she's put a PS in handwriting. Please do submit comments as part of the consultation.
Yes, indeed, and we did. Lady Sylvia has been very helpful.
In trying to navigate this question of an English consultation where you were being asked to respond,
yes.
How did you understand what was going on?
Well, this was really a way of gathering further information from a broader field of people. But the decision-making process was going to be Anglo-centric. And if there was a follow-up, it would be the template in England that our Department of Health would respond to. So from that point of view, if you like, the blueprint would be an English blueprint, and then we would follow from that. And that's indicative of the letter response I got from Simon Hamilton MLA, who was the Department of Health's minister, the one that you referred to earlier. That would have been indicative of his response, where he really said, we take our direction from the Department of Health in England in relation to support mechanisms.
So how valuable did you think your contribution from Northern Ireland was going to be to that consultation?
Well, I wouldn't flatter myself. I think at the end of the day, the government had to make this, as far as they could, a public responsive document, and they were trying to gather and garner information. But I don't think at the end of the day, any contribution we would make would have necessarily had any significant value in that, unless it was being delivered directly through our own system of government in Northern Ireland.
Subsequently, you received a call from Julian Smith MP. What can you tell us about that?
Yes, that was from Julian Smith. Was in January 20. He was still the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and this came on the heels of a lot of work that I'd been doing, and some of my colleagues had been doing, to try and promote issues around the parity of schemes of payment, so that Northern Ireland wasn't being left behind.
Simon, that's my misreading of your statement. Then let us come back to it. If it's January 20, I'd picked up that it was rather earlier. Let's take it in. Let's take it in sequence. My fault.
Yep.
Could we pick up then on the 22nd of January 2019 at Portcullis House? You attended a meeting with a number of representatives from a number of campaign groups, meeting David Lillington and Jackie Doyle-Price. You've said in your statement that a figure of £55 million was said to be the roundabout figure which would resolve the parity issue. Do you know where that figure came from?
Well, yeah, I know that we had made, as a group, that Bill was involved in that in that meeting, and Lynne had a colleague in that meeting, so they'll be both familiar with the circumstances. And the meeting came about as a consequence of a number of correspondences between Sir Brian and David Lidington, when a request was made that the government would be responsive to issues around need and support for sufferers across the United Kingdom. So obviously the campaign group who were invited to that meeting in Portcullis House included representatives from a number of the campaign groups across the United Kingdom. And forgive me,
I was asking you quite a specific question about the figure of £55 million.
Oh, sorry, yes. At the meeting, I noted from where I was sitting that David Lidington sat very quietly, listening very carefully to everything that was being said, but didn't spare much time for eye service with anybody else. As a consequence, he was writing down and making notes, and the only comment he made at the end of the meeting was, "How much is this going to cost?" And we had done some calculations, and we had actually proposed what we felt was a fair and reasonable solution to the financial issues that were being raised by us. And that figure was roughly a figure which was being presented.
So that was presented by the campaign groups?
It was, yes.
In terms of Northern Ireland specifically, you had some meetings with Sue Gray, Permanent Secretary for Northern Ireland's Department of Finance.
I did, yes.
What can you tell us about them?
Well, Sue Gray was Senior Sponsoring Officer of the public inquiry at the time. She had also moved to Northern Ireland as the Permanent Secretary for Finance. And after that particular meeting, I happened to meet her in the airport when we were both travelling back, and we had a conversation. And she said she had been very positive about the meeting, as had other civil servants at the time, and she suggested we meet again. So we had an opportunity for a couple of further meetings, and Sue Gray was very positive about and very, very, very clear on the need for a resolution to the parity issues as soon as possible. So I find her very encouraging in that regard. She was actually a breath of fresh air, because in a sense, the body of the civil service tended to be slow moving and reluctant to accept that there was a need to acknowledge the issues that we were raising, and that would have been addressed and dealt with in a simple way initially anyway, through a form of financial parity. But she had a very clear positive perspective and was quite lateral thinking in how we should, how things should go. So from her, I gained a lot of encouragement to proceed, because she didn't put me off, in the sense that she could see around the corner whereas other civil servants that I did encounter were quite reluctant to move at all.
Was there an additional benefit in your conversations with her by virtue of her role as Permanent Secretary for the Department of Finance? Did that give an additional assistance to or importance to your contact with her?
Well, I in no way tried to exploit her position because I respected her position. So, but beyond that, she facilitated a number of meetings, and in her role as Permanent Secretary for Finance, she was bringing her awareness of the situation around the contaminated blood issues and issues around parity, and therefore, when issues of parity equivalence, i.e. the payment schemes being uplifted, were being addressed, she was in a prime position to indicate to the Finance Minister, Conor Murphy, that this was something that was potentially worthy. Now, I would say as well that there was the new document, new agreement, which spawned the parity, and you may be wanting to go on to that, but nevertheless, she would have had an input into that, as others did.
Perhaps you can take us on. Simon, do just take us on to that. That's exactly where I'm going, about how parity and your work on parity has happened.
Yes, really, a lot of the evidence I've submitted relates to the years 2019, 2020, when we were moving from a position in Northern Ireland of having no government to a position of having our government back. And the NDNA document was an agreement document brought together by all the parties under Julian Smith and Stephen Coveney in the Republic of Ireland. And that document enabled the parties to move forward. And it was a series of agreements and negotiated arrangements. And within that, issues that we had been very strongly advocating and lobbying for, i.e. a parity scheme, those were raised. I did, as you referred to earlier, I did hear from Julian Smith's one of his advisors, civil servants, who contacted me a few hours before the moratorium was lifted on the document and thanked me on his behalf for my contribution. But my contribution was representative of a lot of people's, so I would share that with many other people in Northern Ireland. However, interestingly enough, within that document, at the very end of a series of agreements or commitments on page 9, under the title "Delivering a Fair and Compassionate Society," and that relates back to what Bill had been talking about earlier on in regards to the MACE compassion. The issue of compassion was being represented and recognised here. Under Section 9, there was a commitment to provide parity with the English scheme. And that was a sense for us of real victory. Regardless of what that meant, it meant that government was finally in Northern Ireland recognising the importance of addressing this issue. And that I would say could be interpreted partially on moral grounds. And I say that now because, having listened to Minister Swan a few weeks ago, where he acknowledged the moral issue, and others, the moral battle has already been won in terms of addressing the needs and issues of victims within this process. So that has been contributory to that.
Before we move on from January 2020 into the present day, I just want to pause and explore with you, what were the difficulties that you faced given the political vacuum and the collapse of the political situation?
Yeah, it's a very pertinent question. The reality is, and I know from other aspects of my professional life, that the civil service in Northern Ireland asks a question with doubt if it has to pay money out. And if there's a sense that there's a profit in this for someone other than the department, they would be very reluctant to do it. And that was part of the stalling mechanism we experienced during the period of suspension of the Northern Ireland Assembly. There was an acting civil service. The permanent secretaries of the civil service had power to make decision, but there had been a number of legal cases against decisions they made when significant amounts of finance were spent. And as a consequence of that, they'd lost their power, and they realized that there was a difficulty in making financial decisions. So we were immediately up against it. in trying to promote the idea and trying to advocate for the idea of the parity scheme. And we were aware that lots of meetings were taking place and very little was happening. The other issue in answer to your question is this, and that is that one of the big problems that we find with the civil service, that I find and colleagues find with the civil service here, and perhaps it spreads across government in general, and that is that there, and Bill has referred to it and Lynne has referred to it in their experience as well, and that is that sometimes there is a reluctance to be transparent or a reluctance to explain the process. By keeping us in the dark, we are not helped. By keeping us in the dark over this period, many people became quite disillusioned, very, very distressed, despairing, losing confidence and faith in the system which is supposed to protect them. And therefore, that's not good for their mental health or anything else either. So there were negative impacts during this period. I found the prevarication, the obfuscations, the delaying tactics, the fear that this was going to spring to another consultation and then another consultation until we were consultation exhausted before anyone would make a decision. So we were left really in the wilderness until the minister was appointed.
And if we can pick up there when the minister was appointed, you had a meeting with Robin Swan on the 13th of February 2020, and he wrote a letter to Mervyn Storey MLA recording what happened at that meeting. If we can put that up on the screen, WITN 2339034, please, Shumik. And could I have page 2? We can see at the bottom of this page the following. As you've highlighted in your correspondence following a January monitoring round allocation of 1.03 million to my department, I announced on the 27th of January interim payments for infected beneficiaries of the Northern Ireland Infected Blood Payment Scheme, ranging between £4,000 and £8,000 per person. These interim payments were intended as an immediate measure to address the hurt caused by the uplift in England and to alleviate the financial hardship that may be endured by those infected and or affected by contaminated blood. And then over the page, I wasn't in a position to allocate the full £1.03 million at that point, as I needed first to consider how to make the best use of the remainder of the monitoring round allocation in addressing the needs of our beneficiaries. Whilst I welcomed this short-term funding, a non-recurrent allocation of temporary funding towards the end of a financial year is not sufficient to address all the issues sustainably. Consideration needs to be given to how this issue can be sustainably resolved going forward. Financial support schemes across the UK vary significantly, and simply replicating the English regular annual payments to those infected may not necessarily best address the needs of our beneficiaries. As well as regular payments to those infected individuals, there are a number of other areas that need to be taken into consideration in any future reform, which would increase the additional costs of the Northern Ireland scheme on a recurrent basis. I think that's what you had discussed with him at your meeting. Is that right?
It is indeed. It is indeed, yes. In fact, colleagues from one of the other groups, campaign groups, the Friends and Families group, had met with the Permanent Secretary for Health on a previous occasion as part of our lobbying approach, and they had struggled to make progress. And I have to say that government, once we got our government back and with commitments in place, and fundamentally, in fairness to Mr. Swan, with a minister who was committed to doing the right thing, progress occurred quite quickly. What's interesting in this process is the reality about the cost of support and the fact that the budget within Northern Ireland is rather restricted. And I think this is a bigger issue that the inquiry must take note of, because effectively, while David Liddington found it quite a useful strategy to devolve issues around payment, the reality is and still remains that the devolved assembly, certainly Northern Ireland, and I can't speak for Wales, but I'm sure I'm aware that Wales are still battling with this too with Lynne. I'm aware that the money isn't in abundance, and therefore central government has a responsibility. It's very easy for a minister to say, oh yes, This is definitely a devolved issue. We must respect the devolution the system. Quite right. Devolved assemblies have their part, very importantly, in managing and administering the health and support mechanisms. But because of the way our fiscal operation works in Northern Ireland, we may gather taxes, it goes to England and it comes back. And therefore, the Treasury has a key role in moving forward. If there were a compensation rearrangement at the end of this process, if there were, and it was left under the argument of David Liddington, for example, that it should be left to the devolved assemblies to arrange and make, then it would never happen. And we will be right back to where we started.
Simon, I'd very much like to pick those points up with all three of you on the panel in a moment, but if we can just finish the chronology in Northern Ireland and then pick up those... No, not at all. Then we can pick up those general points. 25th of March 2020, Robin Swan formally announced that Northern Ireland would receive the same payments as those in England, and payments would be made to non-infected widows and widowers. At that point, you still had some concerns. What were they?
Well, yes, we had concerns. I must say, again, in praise of the minister, he made a commitment. He was willing to meet us. He also met the widows, and he was willing to respond. And he did make a commitment that he would meet the needs of the widows in some way, which he did. And further to that now, they are in a much better position because of the follow through with the current funding uplift as it's being finalised. Mr. Swan made commitments, but those commitments were temporary, if you like. There was a question mark over their longevity, and he explained that there was a mechanism that would be required in order for that to happen, and he had to do this a certain way, and he explained that in his own evidence recently as well, that he made the interim payment in the short term. It amounted to over £1 million, at 1.3, I think, and subsequently, once that had been provided in further rounds, monetary rounds, which is the way budget is divided and separated in Northern Ireland, that funding would become established. And I received a letter from him very recently, which also reassured me of that fact outside the period of the evidence I submitted to you.
As you say, things have moved on in Northern Ireland, and the inquiry's heard evidence from Mr. Swan himself. He's also provided a statement in response to your statement, which at the time was critical of him, noting that things have moved on. He states he's taken considerable steps to communicate openly with beneficiaries and has increased payments and widened eligibility to include the bereaved. He says that work continues at pace with the other UK nations to achieve greater parity of support across the UK for beneficiaries, and says he'll be making further announcements in due course.
And I would totally concur with that. That evidence is much more up to date. The reality is we've moved on considerably, and I would commend him for the way he has committed himself and the plans he has transparently laid out to us as well.
In your statement, Simon, you were very pessimistic and said that you now seriously have doubts that effective campaigning and good advocacy will eventually bring about change. Is that still your view?
And I refer to that in my closing statement, if I may.
Of course.
I think that would be suitable then.
I won't steal your thunder. Can I open? I won't. Can I just open the questions to the whole panel to finish off financial recompense before we take a break?
The break. Could we bring it forward?
Of course.
Because I'm afraid I found myself in serious discomfort once again, and very embarrassing. Is that possible?
Absolutely.
Please.
It's absolutely possible. We'll take a break then until 25 to 4.
Okay, thank you.
25 to 4.
Thank you.